All right, let's go with pH balance. This is a very important lecture. All right, so physiologic pH, where pH stands for potential of hydrogen, is a way of quantifying the balance between acids and bases in the body. In fact, pH depends on the concentration of hydrogen ions and can be described with this equation. The cells and enzymes in our tissues and organs work best when the concentration of hydrogen ions is 40 per 10 to minus 9 nanoequivalents per liter, which is a very small number. So small changes to that number matter a lot because these are very tiny numbers. Scientists converted this concentration into a logarithmic function and express it as pH. In this case, a hydrogen ion concentration of 40 per 10 minus 9 nanoequivalents liter works out to a pH of 7.4. Now, there are two important aspects to remember when using this logarithmic function. First, as hydrogen concentrations increase, the pH decreases because of the negative sign in front of the logarithm. Second, since it's a logarithmic function, pH and hydrogen ions concentrations don't have a linear relationship. For example, an increase in pH from 7.4 to 7.6 means a decrease in the hydrogen concentration of 15 nanoequivalents per liter, whereas a decrease in pH from 7.4 to 7.2 means an increase in hydrogen concentration of 23 nanoequivalents per liter. That's why the graph of hydrogen ion concentration versus pH has a curve to it rather than being a straight line. For simplicity, when the body pH drops below 7.4, it's considered acidemia, and when it goes above 7.4, it's considered alkalemia. So be careful not to confuse this with hyperkalemia or hypokalemia, which refers to the concentration of potassium that we just reviewed. So due to this logarithmic relationship, a change in pH in the acidic range, pH minus or less than 7.4, will show a larger change in hydrogen concentrations than in the same change occurred in pH in the alkaline range, that is when pH is above 7.4. Maintaining a pH between 7.37 and 7.42 is essential for the human body. This is accomplished by buffers. The most important buffer system in the body is the carbonic acid and its conjugated base, the bicarbonate ion. Carbonic acid, sorry, I didn't show this. There it is. Carbonic acid forms when carbon dioxide combines with water with the help of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. As a weak acid, carbonic acid easily dissociates in hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Because carbonic acid is such a weak acid, when there are few hydrogen ions around, it will release its hydrogen ion and turn into bicarbonate. And when there are lots of hydrogen ions around, the bicarbonate will bind to one and form carbonic acid, which can go the other way around and split into water and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide can be breathed out through the lungs. So imagine that the extracellular fluid is attacked by sodium hydroxide, which is a strong base. That means that in water, it completely dissociates into sodium ions and hydroxide ions. The hydroxide ions bind to the hydrogen ions, forming water, and the decrease in hydrogen increases the pH a lot. But when there is plenty of CO2 around, it reacts with the water to form more carbonic acid, which splits into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions, rapidly replacing the hydrogen ions and buffering the pH. On the other side, imagine adding hydrochloric acid into the fluid, which is a strong acid. It would fully dissociate into hydrogen ions and chloride ions. Without a buffer, this would cause it to become acidic, since there's more hydrogens and therefore the pH would go down. The new hydrogen ions would get instantly grabbed by bicarbonate ions and converted to carbonic acid, which would then dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. Once again, this buffer normalizes the pH. The great thing is that there's a huge supply of carbonic acid because it's formed from carbon dioxide and water, which are in abundant supply in the body. Finally, if there's too much carbon dioxide, it is blown off by the lungs, and if there are too many bicarbonate ions, they get eliminated by the kidneys. Now, the extracellular fluid, and especially the plasma, is also full of proteins like albumin, which serve as another extremely important buffer system. That's because some of the protein amino acids have exposed carboxyl groups, or COOH, that act as weak acids, meaning that they are ready to release hydrogen ions when the pH begins to rise, while others have exposed amino groups, also NH2, that act as weak bases, meaning they can bind a hydrogen ion, preventing a decreasing pH. In other words, a single protein molecule can function both as an acid as well as a base, depending on the pH it has to deal with. But unlike bicarbonate buffering system, there are only a limited number of proteins in our plasma, which limits how much they can buffer. Alright, until now we've explored the extracellular fluid, but intracellular pH has to stay balanced as well, and this is the pH inside the cells. Cells are full of proteins, and they are the most significant intracellular buffer in this case. An example is hemoglobin, which is found inside the red blood cells. Hemoglobin can reversibly bind either hydrogen ions, which binds to the protein itself, or oxygen, which binds to the iron of the M group. And the interesting thing is that when one of these is bound, the other is released. So when red blood cells are in capillaries of tissues, the oxygen levels are low and the carbon dioxide levels are high, as you know. The CO2 diffuses into the red blood cells, where carbonic anhydrase enzyme combines water with CO2 to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates to hydrogen ions on bicarbonate. Because there's so much CO2 around, the reaction continues in the direction of generating more hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, and over time the buildup of hydrogen ions can cause the pH to fall. To prevent the hydrogen ion concentration from rising too quickly, each deoxygenated hemoglobin binds hydrogen ions. The bicarbonate, on the other hand, moves into the plasma in exchange of chloride ions. And this exchange is called the chloride shift. Keeps positive and negative charges balanced. Now, once the red blood cell gets in the capillaries of the lungs, there's a low level of carbon dioxide there and a high level of oxygen. So the process reverses and oxygen binds to hemoglobin and hydrogen ions are released. Bicarbonate re-enters the red blood cell and combines with the hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which dissociates into water and CO2, and the CO2 gets breathed out by the lungs. Intracellular fluid also has large amounts of organic phosphates like ATP and glucose 6-phosphate, which can serve as intracellular buffers as well. The phosphate group of these organic molecules can serve as a source of or to sink for the excess of hydrogen ions. Finally, remember that potassium in the cell may be exchanged by hydrogens outside when the pH decreases. So it is always a way to rapidly counteract for acids, but this system is also limited and can cause hyperkalemia, as you know from previous lectures. The opposite can also compensate for alkalosis, but at the cost of causing hypokalemia. So you know that potassium levels, they can change very little. It's quite dangerous, so this is very limited. But it's a buffer system, a cellular buffer system. All right, so all these may cause deviations of pH that are classified as metabolic when the problem is bicarbonate, or respiratory when the problem is CO2. So if you think in acidosis in relation with bicarbonate, which is a base, you can get acidic if you lose bicarbonate, and skipping or excreting bicarbonate is done by the kidneys. Either there is a problem in the kidneys or a huge ingestion of bicarbonate or another base. If you think on the chemical reaction, you'll notice that this situation may be compensated by breathing out faster, so more CO2 is eliminated, and at the same time the kidneys will try to retain as much bicarbonate as possible to level the pH. The opposite problem will produce a metabolic alkalosis, and the lungs will try to retain CO2, so more carbonic acid is created to compensate for excessive base and lower the pH. The kidneys, in turn, will try to excrete as much bicarbonate as possible since it contributes to alkalosis, and we want to compensate this. All right. In respiratory disorders, then there is a impairment of respiration, so there is an alteration of the partial pressure of CO2, which is going to reflect as an increase or decrease in alveolar ventilation. So in these cases, we can develop respiratory acidosis, which is a decrease in pH by a reduction of breathing and the consequent increase of CO2. And this will be compensated by the kidney, not the lungs, because there's a problem in the lungs. So only the kidney will compensate, increasing the elimination of protons, of hydrogens, and trying to retain as much bicarbonate as possible. In the case of a respiratory alkalosis, what we have is an increase in pH, and this is due to increased ventilation. So there is a decrease in the partial pressure of CO2. And here again, the kidneys will try to retain as much hydrogen as possible and eliminate as much base, as much bicarbonate as possible. All right. All right. Have in mind that acids are produced constantly associated to the diet, especially if it's rich in meat. So, any increase in non volatile acids alone or in combination with decreased excretion of acids by the kidneys due to a problem in the kidneys or excessive loss of bicarbonate as well as increased chlorine will result in metabolic acidosis. And the most common cause is acute lactic acidosis to that's produced in the cytosol when there is anaerobic catabolism of glucose. This can happen in cases affecting proper ventilation for any cause or when muscular activity is acutely increased, like for instance in epileptic attacks. They are also called, those are seizures, and it's also called grand mal, Jules Caesar knew very well. He had many of those attacks. All right, ingestion of sodium hydroxide or any other strong base, as well as loss of hydrogen, chlorine, or potassium, will cause metabolic alkalosis. If this is combined with a contraction of the extracellular fluid volume, then it gets even worse. This may happen associated to vomiting. We already mentioned this in a previous lecture. And when the vomiting, you lose a lot of volume and many of these electrolytes. But this is even worse when the kidneys try to retain water and bicarbonate is retained with it, decompensating the pH. All right, and here you have how to diagnose these conditions. In the case of the metabolic conditions, you have here two columns with the metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So if you do a blood test, you'll see that the pH is decreased in acidosis. There is bicarbonate also decreased, and this is a primary problem due to whatever problem is causing the metabolic acidosis. And as compensation, you'll see that the lungs are trying to they decrease the partial pressure of CO2. All right, and the opposite happens in the metabolic alkalosis. And here you have the most important clinical manifestations. All right, we will have first signs of compensation. All right, so what the lungs are doing and what the kidneys are doing to compensate for these conditions. In the case of metabolic acidosis, you'll have tachypnea, which is increased ventilation. Okay, you'll have hyperkalemia as well, and acidic urine. Okay, in the case of alkalosis, you will have bradypnea, which may this is reducing the frequency of breathing, and this may take you to a hypoxia of some organs, as well as the opposite, respiratory acidosis. In the nervous system, with metabolic acidosis, we'll have weakness and confusion, lethargy, stupor, and even you may enter a coma. While in alkalosis, we'll have hyperactive reflexes, the patellar reflexes and all those, tetany, seizures, and confusion. And in the cardiovascular system, there will be peripheral vasodilation of the vessels. You'll have bradycardia, which is less a diminished rhythm of the heart. You'll have dysrhythmias, and in alkalosis, you'll have hypotension and dysrhythmias as well. All right, an acute respiratory acidosis may develop when ventilation is impaired, like with problems affecting the respiratory centers of the brain, or any acute obstruction of the respiratory system, like in an asthma attack. If the respiratory problem develops slowly, like in chronic bronchitis, then a chronic respiratory acidosis will result. Respiratory alkalosis is always associated to an increased ventilation known as tachypnea. In these cases, the partial pressure of CO2 decreases and it is commonly associated to panic attacks. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but people breathe very fast, and one of the techniques is give them a bag, plastic bag, so they can breathe in the bag, and this way they retake the CO2 they are losing. And here you have how to diagnose these conditions. In respiratory acidosis, the pH is decreased and there is an increase, a compensatory retention of bicarbonate to try to compensate. And you'll have an increased pressure of CO2, right? This is primary due to the problem in the lungs, all right? And in alkalosis, you have a pH increased and bicarbonate decreased and CO2 decreased as well. And as clinical manifestations, in the compensatory signs are only going to be in relation with the kidneys, all right? So in one case, in acidosis, you'll have acidic urine. In alkalosis, you'll have alkaline urine. Okay, remember the lungs are not working properly here. And in the nervous system, you may have dilation of the brain vessels, and this is going to increase neural activity. So it will result in headaches, behavioral changes, weakness, and paralysis. While in metabolic alkalosis, there will be constriction, just the opposite, decreased neuronal activity, so you'll have dizziness, panic, tetany, very severe seizures, numbness in the extremities, right? In the cardiovascular system, only alkalosis has effects in the shape of dysrhythmias. And here you have a final table, which is very important to show how lungs and kidneys react to every possible situation of discompensated pH. And notice again that in the case of respiratory cause, the lungs cannot do anything and only the kidneys still can try to compensate. And this is important to keep in mind. All right, so thank you very much. This is all about the pH control, and next week we will go with the kidney disorders.